Back in Beirut, a group of heavily armed extremists hijacked a commercial airplane. Their motives are political, and they unleashed fear and chaos among the crew and passengers. Among those on board were 2 American citizens. With attacks on U.S. nationals abroad on the rise, both the FBI and CIA launched a bold and risky mission. Their goal was not just to capture the perpetrators, but to send a clear message to terrorists around the globe. The United States would strike back. During the 1980s, America found itself facing a new kind of enemy overseas, one that didn't wear a uniform. Instead, it operated through a shadowy network of terrorists. Bombings, public executions, and hostage-takings claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent people. My name is Jim Carlstrom, a former head of the FBI's New York office explains. As the violence escalated, new laws were passed, granting the FBI broader authority to combat radical extremism. This is the story of one of the very first U.S. counterterrorism operations, long before the world-changing events of 9/11. It all started on June 11, 1985. Flight 402 of Royal Jordanian Airlines was preparing to depart from Beirut, Lebanon, bound for Amman, Jordan. 66 passengers boarded the plane, including a U.S. citizen and his young son. Then, everything changed. A heavily armed group of terrorists stormed the aircraft. Their first move was to pressure the flight attendants into pointing out any undercover air marshals on board. They wanted to eliminate any chance of resistance. "Keep your heads down," they shouted as their leader forced his way into the cockpit. He ordered the pilots to take off immediately. Their intended destination wasn't Amman anymore. It was now Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. Since the captain didn't speak Arabic, the co-pilot had to act as an interpreter. The hijackers were determined to arrange a meeting with Lebanon's ambassador and the Secretary General of the Arab League, Shelly Calabi. They issued a list of demands, including the deportation of 20,000 Palestinian refugees from Lebanon. During the flight, the terrorists repeatedly assaulted the security personnel on board. They had complete control, at least until the plane entered Tunisian airspace. That's where FBI Special Agent Tom Hansen of the International Anti-Terror Unit came into play. Tunisian authorities refused to let the plane land. They blocked the runway with fuel tanks and fire trucks. The terrorist leader tried negotiating over radio with Tunisian officials, but they wouldn't budge. A meeting with Calabi simply wasn't going to happen. As tensions rose, the terrorists used the plane's radio to broadcast their demands. But with fuel running low and the aircraft still circling above Tunis, the pilot convinced the leader to land in Palermo, Italy. Crashing wasn't an option. They had to refuel. But Palermo wasn't welcoming either. Officials there also denied the aircraft permission to land, blocking the runway just as the Tunisians had. With more than 70 people on board and fuel nearly gone, the threat of a crash was real. "Okay, we're landing," the pilot said urgently. The tower finally cleared them for an emergency landing. Once on the ground, the terrorists demanded refueling, but Italian authorities initially refused. Instead, they played for time. They pretended to make arrangements to fly Calabi from Tunis to Palermo, hoping the bluff would work. But the hijackers were skeptical. Why would Calabi agree to come to Italy if he'd already refused a meeting in Tunis? As the clock ticked and no one arrived, the terrorists issued a horrifying threat. If the plane wasn't refueled soon, they'd begin throwing children off the aircraft. Not long after the chilling ultimatum, authorities gave in. The aircraft was fully refueled, and Flight 402 took off once more, heading back to Tunis. For the second time, the plane circled the Tunisian airport, the hijackers hoping their demands would finally be met. This time, the terrorists insisted on broadcasting their message over the national radio station. But airport officials claimed they didn't have the proper equipment to make that happen. The pilot, trying to calm the hijackers, lied and said the request had been approved. Eventually, the plane touched down again, this time at a different international airport. As the aircraft sat on the tarmac, a new hijacker boarded. He ordered several elderly passengers and children to disembark. Meanwhile, the terrorists once again read their list of demands while the plane flew over Syria and Jordan. But time was running out. More than 24 hours had passed since the ordeal began. The hijackers, realizing they were getting nowhere, decided to change course. Instead of continuing their aimless journey, they brought the plane back to where it all started, Beirut. Once on the ground, the terrorists prepared for the worst. They rigged the front section of the plane with explosives, making it clear they were ready to follow through with their threats. At 9 a.m., the hijacker leader contacted airport authorities. His message was terrifyingly clear. Unless 20,000 Palestinian refugees were expelled from Lebanon by that afternoon, all hostages would be executed. Inside the aircraft, 66 people remained. Among them were 2 Americans and 9 crew members. Tensions hit a breaking point. Then, unexpectedly, the hijackers allowed everyone to leave the plane. One by one, the passengers made their way to the main terminal. Their nightmare, which had lasted more than 30 hours, was finally over. Before leaving, the terrorists tossed hand grenades inside the cabin, using the global media coverage to amplify their message. American law enforcement was determined to track these men down. For the FBI, this was more than just a case. It was historic. A brand new law had just passed, granting them the authority to pursue terrorists who targeted Americans abroad. At that time, Lebanon was engulfed in a brutal civil war. The government had collapsed, and various factions, militant Christians and Muslims, were fighting for control. Beirut, once known as the Paris of the Middle East, was being reduced to rubble. To stabilize the chaos, U.S. Marines were deployed as part of an international peacekeeping force. But instead of restoring peace, violence only intensified. In October 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck packed with explosives into a Marine barracks near the Beirut airport. The blast killed 241 American service members. Just moments later, another explosion struck a French barracks, killing 58 more soldiers. Never before had the U.S. suffered such devastating losses from a single overseas attack. Oliver Buck Revell, a former assistant director of the FBI's criminal division, recalled how the Marine barracks bombing briefly focused America's attention on terrorism. But soon after, the public's focus shifted. Many people still didn't believe the U.S. would become a long-term target. What they didn't realize was that several radical Shiite terrorist groups had already declared war on the United States. Their mission was to drive all Westerners out of Lebanon. Among the most feared groups, according to the FBI, was Hezbollah, widely believed to be responsible for the Marine barracks attack. Even in the following year, the Middle East remained a hotbed of terror. Bombings continued, diplomacy failed, and U.S. peacekeeping efforts fell flat. Back then, the FBI could only observe acts of terrorism abroad. They weren't authorized to act. Special Agent Tom Hansen explained, "Legally, we had no jurisdiction to go after terrorist groups operating outside the U.S. That changed in 1984, when Congress passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. The new legislation gave federal agencies the power to apply U.S. law to terrorists attacking Americans abroad. From that point on, any act of terrorism targeting U.S. citizens, no matter where it occurred, became the FBI's business. The hijacking of Flight 402 was the first case that officially fell under this new law. Even though Flight 402 was a U.S. aircraft and never landed on American soil, the FBI took charge of the investigation. The fact that 2 Americans were among the passengers was reason enough under the new law. It was unfamiliar territory for U.S. law enforcement, a whole new ballgame. Agent Tom Hansen led the investigation, and his top priority was to gather as much intelligence as possible on the individuals behind the hijacking. The FBI was already aware of 2 particularly dangerous groups operating in Beirut, Hezbollah and the Amal militia. Both had formed during the Civil War and were known for using violence to push their political agendas. Investigators suspected that the Amal militia was responsible for the hijacking. Clues pointed to potential help from Beirut airport security personnel, who may have allowed the hijackers access. The anti-Palestinian rhetoric used during the hijacking also matched the Amal militia's known views. By contrast, Hezbollah had typically aligned with the Palestinian cause, especially with the PLO. Still, both groups weren't shy about using brutal force to get what they wanted. Just 3 days after the Flight 402 incident, another hijacking rocked the world. Hezbollah fighters seized control of TWA Flight 847 in Athens and forced the pilot to divert to Beirut. On board were 140 passengers, most of them American citizens. This time, the terrorists made several demands, including the release of specific Shiite and Palestinian prisoners. The U.S. government had no real leverage, and it was unthinkable to give in to terrorist demands. Under pressure, the pilot was forced to fly the plane back and forth between Beirut and Algiers. Each time they landed, the hijackers let some women and children go, but they also wanted to prove they meant business. In Beirut, they brutally murdered Robert Stetham, a U.S. Navy diver. They executed him in cold blood and tossed his body from a plane onto the tarmac. For U.S. authorities, this was a line that couldn't be crossed. We knew we had to act. This couldn't go unanswered, Hansen said. Even after the murder, 39 American hostages remained in captivity. The hijackers released them sporadically, hiding them in various secret locations around Beirut. President Ronald Reagan issued a stern warning. Terrorists, be on notice. We will strike back, whether it's in Lebanon or anywhere else. Your cowardly attacks will have consequences. Behind the scenes, government officials scrambled to find a solution. High-level strategy sessions took place regularly at the White House. The goal was clear: rescue the hostages, fast. CIA agents and allied intelligence services were doing everything possible to pinpoint the hostages' locations and identify the individuals behind the attacks. Every bit of information, no matter how small, could prove vital. Meanwhile, those 39 Americans remained in serious danger. By June 1985, Hezbollah terrorists had taken full control of the hostages and kept them hidden in Beirut. The U.S. State Department began applying diplomatic pressure, seeking help from allies to negotiate a release. Former FBI Assistant Director Buck Revelle recalled, "We reached out to Syria, the Lebanese government, Egypt, Jordan, you name it. We were determined to get those hostages out." Eventually, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad agreed to step in and negotiate with the kidnappers. Thanks to this effort, all 39 hostages were released. President Reagan addressed the nation, his relief palpable. The 39 Americans who were held captive in Lebanon for 17 days are now free and on their way to Germany. They'll be home soon. Today is a day of joy for their families and for our entire nation. But the story didn't end there. With the hostages now safe, the next objective was clear: bring the perpetrators to justice. The FBI began debriefing the former hostages from Flight 847. Investigators showed them photos of known terrorist suspects who had been involved in other hijackings or hostage situations. To their surprise, several witnesses recognized one man in particular, the same individual believed to have led the hijacking of Flight 402. Hansen received confirmation that this man, a member of the Amal militia, had also played a leading role in the second hijacking. He was bragging about it. One witness said he practically admitted he was one of the Flight 402 hijackers. With a primary suspect in sight, the challenge now was finding him. Tracking down a terrorist in Beirut during the 1980s was like searching for a needle in a burning haystack. At the time, the city was divided by what was known as the Green Line, separating the Christian East from the Muslim West. For Americans, and even for many locals, the western side was a no-go zone. Despite having strong contacts within the Lebanese intelligence community, the CIA found it extremely difficult to operate in such a chaotic environment. But that didn't stop them from pressing forward. The CIA kept pushing, quietly gathering tips from informants across Beirut. Eventually, their persistence paid off. They discovered the location of the suspect. But there was a major obstacle. Getting him extradited was virtually impossible. Lebanon at the time barely had a functioning government, let alone one that could negotiate the handover of a high-profile terrorist. Meanwhile, the world was still reeling from a relentless wave of terror attacks. Just in 1985 alone, nearly 700 terrorist incidents occurred worldwide, claiming the lives of over 900 people, including 23 Americans. Faced with mounting casualties, President Reagan created a dedicated task force to fight terrorism. This new unit had one clear mission: examine and improve every legal and operational tool the U.S. had at its disposal to strike back. By January 1986, the task force launched a specialized subgroup called the Operations Subgroup, or OSG for short. The OSG brought together representatives from the FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and the State Department. For the FBI, the OSG offered an opportunity to centralize intelligence and coordinate operations more effectively. Its other major purpose? Planning missions to take down individual terrorists, entire groups, or even state sponsors of terrorism. David Claridge, a CIA official at the time, was one of the visionaries behind this effort. We had to start thinking differently, he explained. Terrorists don't respect borders. A plot might be planned in Syria, but carried out in Rome. That meant all our agencies had to work hand in hand. With that vision in mind, the CIA established its first counterterrorism center, designed to operate across national lines and streamline coordination across every division. It was a bold step forward, and Claridge became its first director. This was something we'd never done before, Claridge said. For the first time, the CIA was organized in a way that could cut through both geographic and bureaucratic boundaries. With the OSG now fully operational, the U.S. was ready to take action. They were looking for a high-impact first case, something that would make a global statement. They needed to prove that America's new laws and counterterror tools were more than just talk. The hijackings of Flights 402 and 847 provided the perfect opportunity. Agents began poring over every detail, assembling the most complete profiles possible of the suspects involved. And then, a stroke of luck. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, already had a trusted Lebanese informant based in Cyprus. He was deeply connected and had eyes on the right people. Even better, he recognized the name of the man the FBI was hunting. Not only did this informant know who the suspect was, he'd actually been in contact with him for over 4 years. This changed everything. Now there was a real possibility of luring the suspect out of Lebanon, away from the chaos, and into a place where U.S. agents could make a move. The informant told the CIA that he had a strong relationship with the suspect, the man believed to be the mastermind behind the Flight 402 hijacking. He was confident he could convince him to travel outside Lebanon for a business opportunity. That was the break U.S. officials needed. If we could get him out of Lebanon and onto foreign soil, said one FBI official, we have a chance to take him down legally and cleanly. But the informant had conditions. He wanted full protection for his family. He knew that if word got out he had cooperated with U.S. authorities, they would be in mortal danger. The U.S. agreed to relocate his entire family under a witness protection program. It was a fair ask, given what was at stake. Now, with cooperation secured, the plan began to take shape. The informant revealed that the suspect had broken ties with the Amal militia and was now involved in the drug trade, running shipments across Europe and the Mediterranean. He was reportedly looking to expand his operations, and that's exactly where the U.S. set its trap. They devised a fake drug deal that would sound too good to pass up. The informant would pitch him a role in a major smuggling operation, acting as a middleman for a powerful international narcotics distributor. The idea was to meet on a yacht in international waters, just off the coast of Cyprus, far from any legal gray areas. To monitor everything, U.S. agents bugged the informant's home to capture all conversations between him and the suspect. These recordings would be vital in court later. The fake deal was enticing. The suspect took the bait. He agreed to meet the supposed drug boss, codenamed Joseph, aboard a private yacht. The location was strategically chosen, outside national boundaries but close enough for a swift operation. But there was still one major question. Who would be responsible for carrying out the arrest? At the time, military operations outside the U.S. were normally handled by the Pentagon. But this wasn't a battlefield engagement. It was a law enforcement matter. After much discussion, the Department of Defense decided the FBI would lead the operation, even though it would take place overseas. That decision was a milestone. It marked one of the first times the FBI would conduct an arrest abroad under full legal authority. The FBI's hostage rescue team, highly trained and court-savvy, was chosen to lead the capture. They weren't just skilled tacticians. They were experts in making arrests that would hold up in a courtroom. Our mission wasn't just to take him down, said one agent. We needed to bring him back alive and put him on trial. That sends a far more powerful message. Preparations were intense. The FBI had to be careful not to infringe on the sovereignty of any nearby countries. Everything had to go by the book. Every detail mattered. The operation, now officially named Goldenrod, was ready to launch. All that was left was a final green light from the White House. It came through in the middle of a phone call. I was about to board a flight to Athens, an FBI agent recalled. Then the Justice Department called and said, "You've got the president's approval. Good luck." Before they moved forward, the FBI reached out to the original passengers and crew of Flight 402. They needed to ensure these witnesses would testify if the suspect was arrested. Many of them agreed to cooperate, willing to face their past if it meant justice could finally be served. With legal ground secured and the mission approved, Operation Goldenrod was ready to strike. In September 1987, Operation Goldenrod officially went into motion. The FBI, CIA, and U.S. Navy coordinated every detail from a command center aboard the USS Butte, stationed roughly 25 kilometers off the coast of Cyprus. Special Agent Wood Johnson, leading the FBI's hostage rescue team, briefed the crew under the cover story that technical issues were being addressed. In truth, the ship was loading up on gear, weapons, and elite personnel. Meanwhile, in Greece, FBI agents discreetly leased a luxury yacht to use as the stage for the arrest. They altered its appearance, switching the flag, changing the name, and scrubbing all identifying marks to make it look like an Italian vessel. The yacht was equipped with tracking systems and communication links to U.S. military and intelligence outposts in Europe and Washington. The CIA, operating from a nearby hotel in the port city of Limassol, Cyprus, disguised their surveillance gear as photography equipment. They were in constant contact with the yacht, the USS Butte, and even the White House. This wasn't just another op, one agent said. This was high stakes. The entire world could be watching. Security was tight. A helicopter stood ready aboard the USS Butte in case anything went wrong. But the key was timing. The suspect had to voluntarily step onto the yacht while it was in international waters. Only then could U.S. agents legally detain him without triggering an international incident. With everything in place, the CIA gave the go-ahead. The informant told the suspect that his big break had arrived. He needed to meet the drug boss, Joseph, on a yacht waiting offshore. The suspect agreed. He arrived in Cyprus and was welcomed into the informant's home. To make the deal seem even more enticing, agents showed him a suitcase full of cash. That clinched it. The suspect openly admitted his involvement in the Flight 402 hijacking during their conversation. That confession, caught on tape, would later serve as powerful evidence in court. But then came a twist. The suspect's name had appeared on a local wanted list. If Cypriot police spotted him, the entire mission could unravel. To avoid that risk, the informant and the suspect checked into a luxury hotel, the same one housing the CIA's command post. Early the next morning, the pair made their way to the yacht, brought there by the informant's brother on a small boat. Agents stationed along the docks confirmed the suspect's identity. Back on the USS Butte, everyone stood by, ready to move. The suspect and the informant boarded the yacht, where two undercover FBI agents greeted them, posing as bodyguards. Two female agents also played roles on board, helping keep the suspect at ease. Everything looked routine. The agents told him that Joseph, the drug kingpin, was just finishing a shower and would be right up. They conducted a quick pat-down, standard for a high-stakes deal like this. The suspect didn't resist. He wasn't armed. He had no idea what was coming. Once inside the yacht's cockpit, an agent gave the signal. In seconds, agents moved in, handcuffed the suspect, and alerted the command center. The arrest was a success. Immediately, the team pulled anchor and left the area. On board the USS Butte, the crew celebrated. Patriotic music played as the American flag was raised. Nearly 300 sailors clapped and cheered as the FBI team returned with their captive. The USS Butte then rendezvoused with the USS Saratoga. The suspect was debriefed on board, offering valuable insights into Lebanon's militant networks and how groups like Hezbollah and Amal operated, with help from countries like Syria and Iran. He was then flown via helicopter to Saratoga, and from there placed on an S-3 Viking aircraft bound for the U.S. The journey required 2 mid-air refuelings, one of the longest non-stop flights of its kind by the U.S. military. The plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. From there, the suspect was taken directly to Washington, D.C., for interrogation and legal processing. In 1989, after a thorough trial, he was found guilty of conspiracy, air piracy, and hostage-taking. The sentence: 30 years in a U.S. federal prison. This case marked a historic first. The first time a foreign terrorist who had never set foot in the U.S. was captured, extradited, and convicted in an American court for crimes committed overseas. His arrest sent a powerful message. The rules had changed. The United States would no longer sit back. If you harmed American citizens, no matter where, you would be hunted down and held accountable. Operation Goldenrod wasn't just a mission. It was a turning point in the global fight against terrorism.